So today we're going to be going over serverless with Next.js. Um, yeah. So first of all, we should talk about what serverless is. So you might hear several phrases being thrown around, like serverless computing, serverless functions, and serverless architecture. But essentially, what serverless is, it's an approach that allows you as a developer to focus more on the actual programming, and you let the handling of server architecture to some sort of third-party service. The code that you write is essentially bundled into functions, and these functions are then packaged up and sent to your third-party services who trigger it for you. So let's talk about some differences between more like a server approach, which is more of a traditional approach, versus serverless architecture. So you could think of running a server kind of like your own house. So you run and manage the server. So that means load balancing, allocating resources such as RAM or CPU, and more is essentially the responsibility is up to you to do that. So the server may encounter idle times. So it's utilizing resources even when you're not actually calling the server, and that's because it's going to always be on. Versus serverless, you can think of sort of like a hotel. So the cloud provider is going to store and run your code for you. So things like your runtime environment, making sure like, let's say, your node is up to date. They manage that for you. So serving your code. So that means, let's say your code normally on a server, let's say you bought a server in New York and you have a user that's in California. It's obviously going to take longer for them to access your site than if the server was in, California. So the difference is in serverless, your cloud provider will be able to move your code to the necessary server that's closest to the user. So if we have that user in California, even though our server may be in New York, our cloud provider will be able to say, okay, this user is coming in from California. We can move this code to a server in California that we own. That way, that user in California will also experience, quick speeds of loading your site. And serverless, because your functions are only ran when they're actually needed, it eliminates the idle time. So you're only really paying for what you use. So let's talk about some pros and cons of serverless. So one of the most obvious pros of going serverless is just scaling. So that means, if you have a small site, like let's say you have some sort of mini project that you just want to share with a few close friends, you're not going to have to pay for a full-blown server to achieve that same functionality. So that means, the resources that you're going to need, you're only really going to pay for when you actually use them. So that kind of goes into the next one, which is lower cost. So you're only paying for what you use versus a server where everything's running at all times. And then it also gives a better focus on development. So because the server architecture is being handled by some sort of cloud provider, that means that you can really focus on just writing the code to make your app run rather than having to worry about, how much RAM you need to allocate to your site or something like that. Some cons of going serverless though is that because it's not running at all times, there are going to be cold starts. So that's when a user accesses your site and they call some sort of function for the very first time. And that means there's going to be some latency because it hasn't been run before. There's also a lack of global state, which is kind of a big thing when it comes to building things like games. So because they're serverless functions, which mean that they don't exist on just one server, but they're just functions that are being run on any server, that means that they lack some sort of global state. And because they lack that, quote unquote state, things like sockets, for example, which require some sort of, persistence, won't work out of the box. That being said, there are some sort of, third-party libraries that are being worked on right now to kind of make that work, but it's not exactly the best right now. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Next.js. So Next.js is a full stack framework that uses React as the front end framework. So full stack, if you haven't heard of the term before, is just the combination of front end, which is sort of the UI and what the user interacts with, and then back end, which is the code like for the server and everything else, the functionality that that we've been working on. So we should talk about the differences between Next.js and React first. So the first one is routing. So Next.js has built-in support for routing. Routing is just, how a user navigates from one page to another. So Next.js uses a file system-based routing, which means that you use folders to differentiate which page is which. To achieve this in React, you have to install something like React Router in order to get that same sort of functionality. React is a single page application, which is statically rendered by the client. So what that means is you're really only rendering one HTML document, and then the content of it is changing. So even though you might think that, okay, I'm using React Router, I'm changing pages, you're not actually switching to a different document. You're using one document and you're changing the components that are rendered on that document, which is why it's called a single page application. Next.js is a multi-page application, so that means that everything is dynamically rendered, or you can dynamically render things on the server, and it's not just one document. So you're actually changing documents, which is why it's called multi-page application. So just to give an example, so on the left might look familiar. That's how we would route in React. So you can see we have these routes right here, and these are essentially saying when you visit this certain path, we're going to render this certain component right here. But routing in Next.js, you could see this is our folder structure right here. So you can see the dashboard folder would represent the dashboard page. And then you'd have settings, which is like sort of the actual file, which represents the root page. And that's going to be right here. So you can see there's definitely a difference in, routing between Next.js and React. Next.js also optimizes your site out of the box. So they have a bunch of different features such as auto scaling your images. So for example, if you have some sort of 4K resolution image and you're opening that image on your phone, for example, there's not really a reason to display that image at full resolution. So what Next.js will do is they'll automatically scale down the quality and the resolution of the image so that it suits your device better without compromising performance. They also have a bunch of ways to defer loading for scripts and CSS. You don't really need to worry about that, but basically it just makes your site run faster. It also has support for middleware. So that's where you can authenticate, modify, and do a lot of different things to incoming and outcoming. So let's talk about when we could use Next.js. So Next.js is a really great option when you want to build full stack applications. So if you're building a site that may interact with a database, use some sort of authentication, have dynamic data that's changing on demand, or you want to build something with an API layer, Next.js is a really great option for that. So we should talk a little bit more about rendering. So Next.js has client-side rendering, and it also introduces another form of rendering, which is not found natively in React, and that's called server-side rendering. So right now we're building Catbook with React and an Express server, and this is a client-side rendering approach. So why should we consider using Next.js and not just stick with, React and Express server? So Next makes the whole process a lot easier because they abstract the whole, building the server part. So all you really need to do is just write functions to do what you want. That means that you don't have to write all that code to build your own Express server and run it. Also, we've talked about how you don't want to trust the client when with sensitive information. So because we have a server layer, that means our data is going to be protected. And then Next.js also pre-renders everything on the server, which means that it not only ensures correctness between clients. So that means like if one computer loads our site and then another computer loads our site, it's ensured that it's going to look the same between them. But it also means that we're going to have better performance because once the computer has run it multiple times, that means the server has already ran it. It can be cached and the site will be running a lot quicker. So let's dive a little bit deeper into client-side rendering. So this is kind of the approach we're using right now with React and Express. So a bundle of HTML and JavaScript are downloaded by the client, which is your computer, and then the client runs that JavaScript to actually render the app on your computer. So here's kind of a flow diagram of what would happen. So we have your client server and your database. So we send a request to the server. Let's say that our page needs some data. So our server is going to send back the code. So it's going to give us an HTML document. Our client's going to hold on to that document. And then our client's going to have to send another request to the server, which is then going to send a request to the database saying that we need some data. The database is going to send it back to our server, and then we're going to send that back to our client, which then our client will handle the process of combining our data and our document. In server-side rendering, the full HTML document is generated on the server. So once it's generated, it's then sent to the client, which is our computer, and the document is generated on each request. So here's what it looks like. So we have our client server and database again. So we're going to send a request to the server. The server is going to generate the document, and then it's going to send a request to the database, and then the database sends the data back, and we combine everything on the server, and then we send that full document back to the client. So we should kind of talk about why it's advantageous. So if you remember the client-side rendering approach, we left the rendering to the client. So we sent everything to the client, and then the client builds it for us. But then in server-side rendering, we got everything on the server first, built it, and then sent it to the client. So we should talk about why this is advantageous. So one of the reasons is because we're letting the server bundle and build our document. So while in most cases, the client may render certain things faster than the server, let's say, overall in the long run, especially when you're building more complex apps, it's a lot better to let your server do that. Just because servers, first of all, you can have multiple different servers which are closer to your users, which means that it's going to be more consistent and reliable in the long run. So if I have, I might be on MIT Wi-Fi, and that might be great. You know, I can load things in a couple of milliseconds. But if someone is in somewhere with not great internet, and you leave the loading to the client, it's going to take a really long time for them to load their page. So by letting the servers handle it, it's a lot easier to build a more consistent sort of performance. Yeah, so clients can vary in performance, and that means that you don't want your site to be unpredictable when it comes to loading. And one of the reasons that we keep coming back to is sensitive data. We just can't trust the client because the client is, you know, sort of like your browser. And you can go into your browser and modify and change a lot of things, and that's not what we want. So we should now talk about what we'd be using in Next.js. So Next.js uses a hybrid sort of approach that combines both client-side rendering and server-side rendering. And this method's called React Server Components. So how does it exactly work? Well, we split our code into client components and server components. So what that means is we have our code that we need to run on the client. We build components like that, and then components that we need data from the server. Those are our server components. So how is this different compared to using client-side rendering or server-side rendering? Well, React Server Components lets the client render our components first. So the client components will be rendered by the page while we're waiting for the server to render our server components. So this is different from the sort of all-in approach. So rather than waiting for the server to render everything, we're only going to render what we need on the server and let the client handle everything else. So client components are sent to the client, server components are rendered on the server. So you could see it's a piece by piece approach versus all-in approach from the previous two rendering methods. So here's the sort of diagram again. So we'll say that a circle is going to be our client component, and then our triangle is going to be the server component, and our server component needs some sort of data from the database. So first, our client's going to send a request to the server, and the server is going to create those two components. So we can send that client component back to the client first because it doesn't need any other data from the database. It's ready to be rendered. So we're going to send that to the client first to render. And then while that's going on, we're going to send a request from the server to the database that's going to say, okay, hey, we need some data to finish rendering this page. So this database is going to get our data. It's going to send it back to the server. And now we're going to combine it in our component and then send it back to the client. From there, the client will finish rendering and then combine everything into our fully loaded document. And yeah, so you can see that approach is a lot better for performance because you're going to be loading things sort of in parallel rather than waiting for something to finish to render something else. So now we're actually going to build a Next.js application. So let's just get started. So first, make sure you have Node.js 18.17 or later. Make sure you have NPM and make sure you have VS Code. Okay, so we're going to create a new terminal. There should be default shortcuts like that. Let me. Okay. We're gonna run. So we're gonna run npx create next app. And once you run that, you're gonna see a bunch of different options that are gonna pop up. So we're gonna type. We're just gonna name it Next.js app. For the TypeScript option, we're gonna say no. ESLint will say yes. Tailwind CSS will say yes. The source directory will say yes. The app router will say yes, and then the default import we're gonna say no. Once you do that, you should see everything being installed. Give everybody a couple seconds to install that. Uh, good. All right. So once you have that, make sure you run npm I to install everything. And then we're gonna move on. Okay, so let's talk about the project structure and what everything means. Because you're gonna see a lot of things in the project, and you might be wondering, what each thing actually means. So first of all, node modules, you might have seen this in a lot of your projects like Catbook. This is just whenever we're using Node. These are all the dependencies that our project's gonna need. So you're not gonna have to worry about that. You'll notice it's grayed out because of a file we call .getignore, which we'll go over in a bit. But essentially, you don't want, it's a lot of dependencies and we don't want to download this every time we run a project. So yeah, that's why it's grayed out. Public, this is just a folder that's going to contain all of our static assets. So that includes our images, videos, PDFs, etc. This is the source folder. So this is where we're actually going to write our code. So our components, our pages. This is just a config file. .getignore, this is a pretty powerful file. This essentially tells us, it tells Git what to ignore from committing. So if there are certain things that you don't want to show up in your Git repository, you're gonna write it in your .getignore. So things like your environment files, node modules, etc. This is another config file. This is config options for Next.js if you ever want to actually change some things. And then these are just essentially product labels for your project. And this tells npm what to install. You can ignore this. And then this is just a config file for Tailwind. Okay, so let's get our project started. So go into the terminal and type in npm run dev. And you'll see something like this show up and it's going to say ready in some X amount of time and then localhost 3000. Okay, So if you got it working properly, you should see something like this. And this is just the boilerplate that they have. All right. So once you've done that, we're gonna go over to our source folder and we're gonna make a new folder. So we're gonna call it components, and that's gonna just house all the components that we're gonna be writing. So your source folder should look something like this. There should be two folders, an app and components. Make sure your components isn't inside the app folder. Okay. So now we're gonna clean up some of the boilerplate. So let's open app and go to page.js. And you're gonna see a lot of stuff in here. We're gonna remove everything between the main tags. So you could just get rid of everything in between and just leave the main tags. Move the import as top. And then we're just gonna add some boilerplate that we're gonna write. And just for this part of the lecture, we're gonna be building like a bank statement viewer. So let's add a section. All right. And then if you go to, this is what your page should look like. So it should just be blank. And then you have the text that says bank statement view. All right. By the way, all of the purple text right here is just Tailwind. So it's just for styling purposes to make it easier to see. If you don't want to actually write it or you miss it, it's not a big deal. It's just for aesthetics. Okay. So we're gonna create our UI components now. So let's go into our components folder and make two files. So one's gonna be called statement item.js, and then another item is gonna be called statement table. So our statement item is going to represent a singular item in our statement history. And we're going to have multiple of these. So it's a good idea that we're going to be abstracting them into components that we could reuse. And then we're also going to be building a statement table. And this is just going to be like a container for all of our statement items. And that's where we're going to be fetching our data. So let's go into statement table first. And we're going to write. And for now, we'll just return like an empty section. Next, we're going to go into our statement item and we're going to kind of do the same thing. The difference between this function, like this component and statement table, you might notice statement table, we use async, but in statement item, we didn't. That's because we're going to be fetching our data in statement table, which is why we're going to need async. But in statement item, we're not going to be doing any of that, so we could leave out the async keyword. Okay, now we want to actually add the statement table to our page. So go back to page.js in your app directory. And then at the top, we're going to make sure we import it first. So import statement table. You should see it being autofilled. And then underneath our header where it says bank statement viewer, we're just going to call statement table. So your page.js should look something like that. Okay, so now we want to actually fetch the data. So we're going to be using an API endpoint from Sample API. It's called the fake bank endpoint. So we're going to go to our statement table, and we're going to want to write a function at the very top. And this is going to essentially fetch all of our data. So it's going to be async, and we'll call it get statement history. And what this is going to do is essentially send a post request to this endpoint and get us the data that we want. So once we wrote that function, we're going to want to come into our component, and then we're going to write, we're essentially going to take in that function. So we'll call it right here at the very top and just initialize it to some variable. I'm calling it statement history. You can call it whatever you want. So your code should look something like that. All right. Let's just go over .map really quick because we're going to be using it a lot. So .map is an iterative function and it returns a new array, so it doesn't modify the original one. And this just gives us a way to manipulate a bunch of elements at once. So as you can see here, we have, let's say I have like an array of names, and I want to modify each element. That's going to be our greeting. So we could use names.map, and then we pass in the name, and then we have some sort of operation that we're doing here to kind of modify that, and that's what it would look like. Okay, so using that same idea, instead of modifying strings, we're going to be passing in child components. So let's go to statement table, and then right here in the return, we're actually going to take in, you want to use the curly braces, so this allows you to kind of escape the HTML. So if you notice, if I try writing statement history as is, it's just going to be rendered as text. So in order to actually get it to recognize that it's code that we want to write, we're going to use the curly braces. We're going to type in statement history or whatever variable you set the result of our function to be. You're going to write .map, and then we're going to call item data for each item, as well as a key. So the key allows React to render our components better when we have multiple of the same one. That way it's sort of unique, and React can tell which one is which. And then we're going to write statement item inside. It's self-closing. And then we're going to pass in the data as a prop. So we're going to say data equals item data, and we're going to say the key is equals to key. And if you see like the 3 dots, that means that you didn't import the component. So I'm just going to import it at the top. So your code should look something like that. All right. So like we talked about before, client components are essentially what we're giving to the client to complete the job, while server components are going to be rendered on the server first. So if we use any sort of React hook, such as use state or use effect, that automatically turns whatever code that we're writing into a client component. So that means it's really important that you're separating what you need on the client versus what you need on the server. So you're gonna have to abstract whatever code that you use that uses, like, say, use state or use effect into some sort of client component and kind of separate that from your data. So if you've noticed, you have to put use client. So we're going to go into our statement item. Because we're not rendering any data or anything like that, we want it to declare it as our client component. If you don't write use client at the top, so you use the quotation marks and write use client. If you don't do that at the top of your file, Next.js will just automatically assume that that file is a server component. So that's why we're going into statement table and we're writing use client. Okay, so now I've told you that. I'm gonna try and identify what statement table is, what kind of component it is. So if you think it's a client component, point to the right side of the room. If you think it's a server component, point to the left side of the room and raise both hands if you're not paying attention. It is a server component. So how do we know it's a server component? Well, we could just look at the very top. If there isn't any sort of string that says use client, then we know that it's automatically a server component. Okay, so we talked about destructuring a little bit before, but that's what we're gonna do to kind of make it easier to work with our props. So we're gonna go to statement item, and inside the very top, we're gonna add in the curly braces, and then we're gonna type in data. So instead of what you might be familiar with is just writing props and then doing things like props dot data, props dot whatever. This just destructures it so that we don't have to write props dot something every single time. This also works in React. Yeah, and then inside the divs, we're gonna or not inside the divs, at the very top, we're gonna add some stuff. So we want to import use state first. So let's import it from the top. And remember, if you're importing use state, that means you're forced to use a client component. So make sure you know where you're using your use state. So we'll set one of them to be category. So category and set category. And we're going to say the default state is going to be data.category. So that's just going to be whatever category that we get from the data that we're passing in. And then we'll say the default description is going to be the description from data. And the date is going to be whatever the default date is. You might be wondering why we have a use state up here, but then these two are just normal variables. I'm just doing it just so we can modify category. If you would like to modify the description and data as well, you can do the same thing that we did with category. All right. So now we need to add an on-change event handler. So an event handler is essentially a function that tells us, how are we going to handle certain things when events actually happen. So an example of an event is like when you click on an item, or in this case, in our input, which is, where we're like writing, text, whenever we hit a key or let's like say hit backspace, that's going to fire an event. So we want to write something to actually handle what happens when, a user actually clicks a key. So in this case, we want to change our category. So let's say I have the category of animals and I want to change it to food. You want to allow the user to type it, but how are we gonna, allow the user to type it and modify it on the client? So in this case, we're gonna be using useState. So we're gonna have a input right there. We'll put it inside our div. It's gonna be of type text because we're gonna be writing text. The value of the input is gonna be category, and that's our use state right there. And then we want to write an event handler to handle what happens when someone clicks it. So you're going to put in the parentheses and you're going to pass in E. E just represents event. And then we're going to write the arrow and we're going to say set category e.target.value. E.target.value is just the value of whatever is inside the input. So what this is saying is whenever an event fires, we're going to set the category to be whatever is inside of that input. I'll give everyone a couple seconds to write that down. And then I'm just going to add some styling just to make it easier to see. All right. So we're going to add that, make sure that's in the inside your div component. And then we'll just add the rest, our description and our date. Oops, that's a typo. We'll add our description and our date just in here. We're not going to be changing them, so we can just leave them as is. So your statement item should look something like that. So this is what your entire statement item should sort of look like. Um, all right. So if you go to your localhost now and you open it, you should see a bunch of data just on that page. If you refresh, you notice it loads. If you try refreshing really fast and trying to see if there's any sort of flash of information, you won't see anything just because it's rendered on the server. So since everything's rendered on the server, the moment you render the page, all of this data is already here. So that's sort of like that performance that we're looking for. And then you could see we have our mix of client components and our server components. So our server component was this table right here, this entire table that, contains all of these items while also maintaining our client component functionality. So if I were to click on one of the names right here, like the category, we can change it to whatever we want. And it's not going to modify anything else. So we go here. All right. And if you didn't get, if you missed something or you just want to play around with it yourself, you can go to weblab.is/bank. And you could just access the final result there if you want to play around with it. But yeah, that should be it.